Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of Advancing Together, a national symposium on social change and racial justice in America. Yesterday, for those of you who participated, we explored the relationship between justice and truth. Today's theme is participation in transformative social change, and we begin this morning with a panel on the subject of solidarity, a path to a more just and inclusive society. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University and co-director of the Center on Modernity and Transition. And it's both a pleasure and an honor for me to be moderating this morning's conversation with such a distinguished group of fellow panelists. Barbara Fields is professor of history at Columbia University and author with Karen Fields of Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. Ted Johnson is Senior Fellow and Director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His forthcoming book is When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. And Adam Rothman is Professor of History at Georgetown University and author of Slave Country, American Expansion, and the Origins of the Deep South. Barbara, Ted, Adam, a very warm welcome to you all.
Thank you very much for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. Barbara and Adam, last summer you published a piece together in Dissent magazine, which begins by describing the killing of a young woman named Hannah Pfizer by police. As you describe it, Hannah Pfizer is driving to work in a small city in Missouri when she runs a red light, is stopped by police, and a few minutes later, she ends up dead. According to police reports, Hannah Pfizer was quote unquote non-compliant and threatened to shoot the officer, but later no gun was found in her car. And of course, Hannah is no longer here to tell us what happened from her perspective. Your telling of this story had the intended effect of conjuring in my mind the image of a Black woman. But of course, you reveal that in fact, Hannah Pfizer was white. And you go on to make the case that skin color does not grant immunity to injustice and marginalization, and that solidarity can be forged by convincing white voters that what's good for Black people is also good for them. Now, I know that you've received some pushback on this piece, and certainly many of your readers will ask, why are Barbara Fields and Adam Rothman directing attention away from the distinctive injustices that Black people have suffered in this country for centuries? I want to give you a chance to respond to that reaction, but let me couch the question, if I can, in somewhat broader terms. How do we shine a bright light on the things that bind us together without blinding ourselves to the distinctive experiences of oppression that demand our attention? Barbara, let's begin with you.
Well, I'd like to start with a comparison. Comparisons are never perfect, but let me use this one. Toward the beginning of his autobiography, Frederick Douglass makes a sort of concession to what he knows most of his audience will assume about slavery, that it's terrible in the Deep South, but it's actually a whole lot better in Maryland. And Douglass, without challenging his audience's preset views head on, says, well, just let me tell you how it worked for me in Maryland. And he proceeds to make a case that if people understood it properly, was essentially, let's talk about Maryland being better than Louisiana. Slavery is one system. Its essence is domination and exploitation. And it's the same in the Upper South as it is in the Lower South. And moreover, we can't get rid of it anywhere until we get rid of it everywhere. Mm-hmm. And to me, and I don't think it would have occurred to him that anybody would wonder, well, why are you drawing attention to slavery in Maryland and drawing attention away from what's going on in Alabama or Louisiana? Because his point was, let's talk about how this system operates. And that's how I react to the question, well, why are you drawing attention away from what's distinctive for Black people? And I don't think we did that. But to me, it's instructive that on one occasion when then President Donald Trump was asked about the killing of Black people, he said, well, white people get shot too. Now, what is our proper response to that? If our response to that is, well, Black people are different, then we have given up, we have surrendered. Because the proper response to that should have been, well, that was wrong. Nobody should be being shot by the police for no reason.
Thank you, Barbara. Adam, what's your response?
Yeah, it's always hard to follow Barbara Fields, but I've been following Barbara for a long time, and it's been to my benefit. I think that it's important, it's very important not to see the police shooting of Black Americans as something that's unique to Black Americans. That the thing that's distinctive about the police shooting of Black Americans is it happens at a distressingly high rate, out of proportion to their presence in the population. But it's the same phenomenon. Getting shot by the police hurts. The result is the same, no matter what you look like. And the result for Hannah Pfizer was that she ended up dead. And that's the same experience that hundreds, over the years, thousands of Black and Latino and other Americans have experienced. It's an important question why that happens to certain groups more than others. But as Barbara says, it's one system. It's one system. And that system is about overweening and unchecked police power. Barbara invoked the example of Frederick Douglass from the 19th century, and we are both historians, and we drew some inspiration for analysis from the anti-slavery movement of the 1850s. Mm-hmm. And I think it's instructive because the anti-slavery movement operated on a number of different levels. But what they didn't do was to say that white people were immune from the prospect of being enslaved. They actually made the opposite argument. They said the slave power is coming for you too. And that's why you should mobilize against it. And I think forging that kind of solidarity was important to the anti-slavery movement and could be very important today to the movement to check police violence.
Ted, I want to get your reaction to this, but before I do, I want to note that your work and writing also highlight the recognition of our shared interests as a basis for collective action and solidarity. For example, in one article which foreshadows your forthcoming book, you write, as long as racism is permitted to set citizens against one another, everyone in the polity is harmed. There is little incentive for government to facilitate better schools, more affordable healthcare, more economic and employment security, or any of the public's costly priorities if they can be averted by simply exploiting racial divisions. How do we coalesce around these points of unity without assuming sameness or uniformity of experience? Ted?
Yeah, so, the way I look at it is much like what's been said previously. If you want to know what's wrong with America, with our systems, with our structures, look at the experience of Black people in America, the historical experience and contemporarily. And what you will find is that the things that are broken, break first on Black people many times. And so it's not that they break exclusively on Black people. And this is the point. It is that when states abuse their power, that abuse of power often is wielded most or disproportionately on those that are at the lower rungs of the hierarchy, as socially constructed as they may be. But it does not mean that those abuses are contained to the lower hierarchies. And so we basically have a state that is in breach of its end of the social contract for all of its citizens. And as long as the state can exploit divisions within the citizenry, then those that are most harmed by it are further disadvantaged, and those that are harmed by it at a lower rate, but still harmed nonetheless, find some comfort in their position in the hierarchy and are willing to look at the harms happening to the lower end as being a result of biological or intellectual or social cultural deficiencies, and not as a problem of the state being unwilling to deliver on its end of the social contract. So what does this all mean in this grand multiracial democratic experiment that we call the United States? This means that if this nation of 330 million people of different races, ethnicities, religions, regions, creeds, customs, etc., are to come together and stop being democratic strangers and establish civic friendships, then we have to find something that binds us together. A lot of nations that claim success in this realm either say we don't talk about race and ethnicity here because it's not important, or they're homogenous societies where racism doesn't play the role that it does here in the United States. We have a bigger challenge, and this is why this is the promise of America. If we can figure out how to create an egalitarian, multiracial, democratic society, we will have done something that no other major nation state has ever accomplished. What this means, though, is not that we have to whitewash away all of our distinct racial and ethnic identities. It means we have to find a superordinate identity that brings us together. We have the blueprint for this. Again, as imperfect as the framers and founders were, Americans ostensibly believe that we're all created equal and that we all have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if this is the idea that binds us, if this is the belief system, the promise that binds us, then we can find commonality, uniformity in this belief system without ridding ourselves of the other identities that have shaped our path in the United States. And so what we're asking of our society is to hold multiple identities at once and not to subjugate one in favor of the other, but instead to experience the American project in a way that allows all of us to adhere to the same belief systems in our equality and our right to liberty, et cetera, and also account for the distinctive paths of our groups in America. Women have a particular path that's different from men. Black people have a particular path that's different from white people or Asian American, and Black women have particular paths that are different from all of those. And we don't have to wash away those differences in order to realize solidarity. In fact, the true solidarity is the acceptance of difference and standing together anyway in service of these higher principles.
We'll come back actually to a deeper exploration of national solidarity and national identity a little bit later in the panel. But Barbara, did you want to respond to that directly right now? I saw you move your head a little bit.
Yes, I not particularly responding to that, but just a couple of things that that have been on my mind to say. And one of them is something that Jim Hightower, who publishes that marvelous newsletter, the Hightower Lowdown, has a habit of quoting something that his father always used to say. Everybody does better when everybody does better. Mm-hmm. And it is very hard to get Americans to understand that as a working principle. As long as we seem to have a conception of justice, even those of us who are most concerned with justice because we're most aware of where it's denied, we seem to have a habit of what Adolph Reed has called disparity thinking when we think about justice. So justice, if you take that way of looking at things to its logical terminus, then Black people will have achieved justice if they are, when unarmed and innocent, uncharged with a crime, shot dead by the police in exactly the proportion that they make up of the population. And when white people are shot dead by the police in the proportion that they make up of the population. As soon as I put it like that, it's obvious to everybody, that's not what we're after. We don't want injustice and exploitation and cruelty and inhumanity to be visited on people in the proportion that they represent of the population. We want to get rid of those things. And what Adam and I were talking about in our article, and what we do in our work, along with many other historians, is focusing on those aspects of our history that have made justice impossible. And I, in my writing and in my teaching, am especially concerned to get some of the notions out of the way that are just derailing. And one of them, I practically break out in hives every time I hear the expression racial justice, for example. And I tell my students that racial justice is to justice as half-truth is to the truth. Half-truth isn't a kind of truth, it's a lie. Racial justice isn't a kind of justice. It is a type of injustice. And so I would like to banish it. My students know that they're going to get a squiggly line if they use that expression in their papers. And I think it needs to go, because racial justice, when you think about it, and this is an insight that I got many years ago from another of my students, racial justice is exactly what segregationists considered themselves to be administering. The justice that's appropriate for Black people. We don't need that.
Could I jump in?
Absolutely.
I think I've read Barbara and Karen Field's make this very point in Racecraft, and I've heard Barbara talk about it, and I think I understand it. And I just want to emphasize how difficult it is to make that point today, because the phrase racial justice is everywhere.
Yes.
And it seems like such a progressive aspiration. We all want racial justice, but there is Barbara's identifying a real problem with that concept, which is that it carves off a certain domain of life as particular to Black people. And it makes it easier for the rest of us to say that has nothing to do with me. Why should I care about racial justice as a white person? Because it's not about me. That's one of the problems that way of thinking about the problem of justice poses. Black people getting shot by the police at disproportionate rates is a problem of justice, more than it is a problem of racial justice. And when you think about it as a problem of injustice, you can also see how other people are drawn into that problem, like Hannah Pfizer. Unfortunately, the shooting of Hannah Pfizer is not an issue of racial justice. And that allows people all over the place to ignore it. It was an enormous injustice and something that should be attended to. And it also provides the possibility for all of us seeing ourselves as having a stake in this issue.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're going to move next actually to directly talk more about the arguments in Racecraft and their implications for this conversation. But before we do, Ted, I want to give you a chance in case you wanted to add anything to this conversation.
Yeah, what I love about this conversation is that we're talking about the actual meaning of words and not the bumper sticker meaning that the public tends to assign these words. So if you think about, if we were to solve racial justice tomorrow, that does not mean we have a just society. It just means, as Barbara said, we have reduced disparities between the type of justice that white people receive and the type of justice that people of color receive. The same can be said for inequality, socioeconomic inequality writ large. If we achieve racial equality tomorrow, it does not mean we've achieved gender equality or equality between those who are able and those who are disabled. So these words mean are more expansive than we often consider them to be in public conversation. And that said, that there is, in my view, some utility in drawing attention to disparities between groups, especially when we talk about what public policy can do about these things. A lot of the problems we have in this country are not problems of policy, but of character, of our willingness or unwillingness, ability or inability to see people who are different from us as equal to us and as deserving of life, liberty, pursuits of happiness as we are. And so public policy can help us address some of the experiences of these inequalities in our nation, but they do not solve the problem of inequality, because that is a broader and a much deeper sort of individual and collective effort. So this is sort of a yes and in agreement with everything that's been said.
Well, we met, I'm sure we'll come back to all of these questions, but we met as panelists, all of us on the screen, a couple of days ago to discuss mostly logistical matters, but of course we ended up also having a very interesting conversation in which, Adam, you mentioned that your article with Barbara makes the case for appealing to people at the level of narrow self-interest framed in terms of race. But another necessary strategy, you said, is to convince people that there are that their identities and interests need not be defined by race. There are, as you put it, other ways of imagining who we are. Barbara, that point seems to go quite directly to the argument you make in your really breathtaking book, Racecraft. Now, I suspect the ideas in that book will be well known to many in our audience today, but I'd like to ask you to talk about them briefly in the context of this discussion. What is Racecraft? And what are its implications for questions of solidarity?
Well, when I give a brief definition of racecraft, the way I usually put it is that racecraft is the social process by which racism is transformed into race. Racism, as my sister and I understand it, though, it's not a state of mind, it's not an emotion. It is an act, and it is the act of assigning people an inferior legal status or social status on account of their presumed or ascribed ancestry. And so our argument is that it's not that you start with race and out of it you get racism. It's that you start with the act of distinguishing. You start with the act of racism, and that is what produces the illusion of race, because race is an illusion. And racecraft is what the mental processes that go along with the social processes is the reason that in much public discourse in this country today, slavery is understood by the shorthand race. It's not about race. It is about the exploitation of people's labor. And the illusion of race comes out of the enslavement of people of African descent. And as to where that leads us in our current situation, I think it's pretty much what we were discussing before. Arriving at an understanding that the outcome of a process of that is based on power, the use of power in differential ways. The outcome is to produce a situation in which people have the illusion that the differences are inborn and rather than the product of something else. So slavery as race means that you think that slavery is inherent in in the slaves, rather than slavery is an act of the persons who carried out enslavement. And if you're under the spell of that kind of confusion, then you are completely disabled from any kind of social action to end it. In the time of slavery, understanding that meant understanding, as I was illustrating with Frederick Douglass, that if you have slavery anywhere, slavery, freedom is mortgaged everywhere. So that even in the states where slavery had been abolished in the early 19th century, it was still possible for Black people to be kidnapped and taken away to be enslaved in places where slavery still existed. Adam wrote a book recently illustrating that even after slavery ended in this country, freedom remained mortgaged as long as slavery was possible somewhere else. His book concerns children who were kidnapped from the United States to Cuba and the struggle that the mother had to get them back. Racecraft is the outcome of the act of racism, but it can entangle people forever in the illusion that comes out of that experience, so that even those who are the targets of the aggressor are ready to accept that their identity, that being the targets of the aggressor is an identity that comes out of their being rather than something that comes out of someone else's action.
Adam, I'd like to briefly get your reaction to what Barbara said, but maybe I'll tack on a question as well. In light of Barbara's comments about the artificiality of these identities, what would you say to people who feel that race is somehow deeply constitutive of who they are?
My reaction to Barbara's argument is I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass's point that the cause of slavery was not color, but crime. Mm-hmm. That it was a criminal act inflicted on people of African descent. It wasn't the result of them being Black. In fact, the idea of them being Black was itself a consequence of their enslavement. I think I'll get to your question in a second, but I do want to say something about the argument that we make in our dissent article, because I don't actually think that we are advocating for making an appeal to white Americans on the basis of their being white. That's not what we're doing. We are in fact kind of saying the opposite. We're saying your whiteness isn't going to save you. Poor white people are vulnerable to these forms of violence in myriad ways. And, with the increasing precarity of people's economic, people's livelihoods today, people can fall into very vulnerable positions very quickly. And your skin color is not going to provide you any protection from that. And I think that, there are two ways to forge the kinds of solidarities that Ted is talking about and that we're talking about. One is to cultivate forms of sympathy or empathy, if you prefer, saying, can you see yourself in another person's shoes? Can you imagine what they're going through? Can you feel it yourself? And that can be the form of very powerful solidarity. And I think we've seen that grow and develop in the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think that there are limits to that kind of appeal. It just is not going to win some people over, especially if you're telling them at the same time that they don't have to worry about these things happening to themselves. I think the other way to build solidarity is through appeals to self-interest. Like this could happen to you if you're not careful, if you don't organize to stop it from happening to somebody else. It's not an appeal to race, it's an appeal to people's life situations and the possibilities of what might happen to them, which is kind of different.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Because the consequence of telling, of having a message that says, well, these are things that happen to Black people, and we expect everybody else to join in sympathy because they understand and blah, blah, blah. But one of the consequences of that is that we actually disarm ourselves of one very powerful weapon, in that when these things do happen, which they always do happen to people who are not Black, we don't have a way to talk about those. They're not going to have a public profile. Adam and I, because Adam is the one who first sent me a link to a story about Hannah Pfizer, and he's kept me informed about what has happened since. And the officer who killed her got away with it, essentially, was not charged. And there hasn't been any kind of public outcry about it. So how do you tell people, white people who are not engaged in any sort of movement and perhaps were never tempted to go to a Black Lives Matter demonstration? How do you talk to them about these things if, when it does happen in a situation like Hannah Pfizer's, there is no public recognition of that? I was actually hoping, unrealistically, of course, that Black Lives Matter spokesman would have said in the wake of Hannah Pfizer, you see what we've been trying to tell you. And that actually did happen a few years ago in the instance of a young white man who was killed by the police in a small town in South Carolina. And most of the neighbors, his family's neighbors, white neighbors, kept quiet about it, probably out of their embarrassment. They didn't know what they should say because it didn't feel right to them to attack the police, but on the other hand, this was their neighbor and so forth. And the only person who did speak up was, in fact, the local Black Lives Matter person who went to the family and expressed solidarity and said, this is what we're talking about. And I would like to hear more of that, because it is what Black Lives Matter has been talking about. Adam joked once that the phrase all lives matter really means nobody's life matters. Black Lives Matter means all lives matter. Right. And that, I think, is something that needs to be emphasized. I have had my skepticism right along about Black Lives Matter as a slogan, but it has always been a slogan that means all lives matter and so do ours. And that aspect of it could be the means of expanding if we make the instances where these things happen to other people part of the same conversation, because they are part of the same conversation. Having police officers trained to regard members of the residents in the area that they serve as hostile people and themselves as an army of occupation is going to mean that you'll have this kind of stuff all around. But if we can't respond to it in a way that responds to the problem as a whole, but instead we can notice it when it happens to this person and not when it happens to that person, then we lose one of our greatest resources. Because if we make use of it, then Hannah Pfizer's death was also an argument for Black Lives Matter.
That's a very powerful point. And Adam, I certainly didn't mean to imply that you were suggesting that you and Barbara had framed your argument as interests framed in terms of race, but rather the point was what Barbara was saying, that these interests are cast, just by our social and political discourse in racial terms. Ted, do you want to weigh into this before we move on?
I do. So look, the United States original sin was not that white people hated Black people. Its original sin was that it was a nation founded on the idea that we're all created equal with these unalienable rights, and it enslaved people right alongside that declaration. The problem with Jim Crow wasn't that white people stopped Black people from voting. It is that a nation that says voting is one of the highest duties of citizenship prevented a group of people from participating. The problem with just about everything, with lynching, for example, wasn't that white people were killing Black people. It was that a society structured on law and order was allowing people to operate outside of the law, outside of due process, outside of these constitutional rights, and render a form of justice that they thought was appropriate. So again, the point is that these Black experiences, the Black American experience, is a canary in the coal mine for the things that are broken in our society, for the hypocrisy in the country. So when we talk about justice and equality, when we say racial justice, racial equality, what we're saying is look at the experience of Black people and you will see why we don't have a just society, why we don't have an egalitarian society. Not that Black people are broken and don't know how to operate in it, or that white people have perfected some notion of it and are waiting for others to assimilate. When Lyndon B. Johnson went before a joint session of Congress in 1965 to argue for the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 65, he says, there is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is an American problem. The problem was that, not that, again, white people were stopping Black people from voting, but that this democratic society was excluding intentionally a group of people for no other reason than their race. The last thing I'll say on this is that the problem here is, and especially because of the way slavery was carried out, it was people with Black skin that were subjected to it. It's that the race, it's not just an illusion, but it's an optical illusion. There is an ontological mark of race, so that when I walk into the room, the history of Black people follow me into that room. And it doesn't allow me to be treated as an individual by others, no matter how much I insist on that. When I'm pulled over by police, they see a Black male in a particular car. They don't see Ted Johnson with his fancy degrees and all of those things, who's worthy of a little bit more grace. And so the problem of race signals the problem in our society. But those who have been subjected to the shortcomings in our society most often, or most egregiously, their experiences are shaped by their identities are shaped by the summation or the accumulation of these disproportionate or discriminatory experiences. And so in this way, race becomes an identity because of how society treats you. And that treatment is not just commentary on the inherent value of Black people. It is a commentary on the hypocrisy of our country that, again, espouses freedom and liberty and democracy, and then intentionally excludes people from participation in it for little other reason than national interest at any given time and the group that the people subjugated belong to.
Could I add to that, because I think that's well said, but may I add to it that the singling out of Black people also serves as a kind of alibi, right? Because it's not just that the disfranchising of Black people meant Black people don't get to vote. The process of disfranchising Black people disfranchised much of the white electorate in the southern states. And that was not by accident. The people who were in charge of it knew what they were doing, and they knew which white people they wanted which white people's votes they wanted to suppress. So they were able to do that under the cover of a movement that whose authors well understood who the targets were. But today, I think a lot of Americans don't even understand that. They don't realize that voting participation in southern states among white people went from 70% down to 30% practically overnight. If they can do this to Black people, they can do it to everybody, is the point. And who is included in that everybody will depend on how power works in our political system.
I agree with that 100%. And you're absolutely right that Black has become shorthand for injustice or inequality in a way that masks all of the other people that are caught up in injustice and inequality. So I think, and sort of, I made that point very bad. I think you made it much better than I did. But that canary in the coal mine piece suggests that we are not the only ones that are going to be harmed by this, but the gas, the noxious fumes are coming for all of us. And so injustice is not a Black problem. Injustice is an American problem. And no matter what your race or ethnicity, if you don't fix injustice, you will eventually get caught up in it.
I'm seeing actually some questions in the chat about how we go from this to building a positive vision of justice. And I do want to leave time to get your thoughts on that, maybe towards the end of the conversation. But if we could talk a little bit more about solidarity, which is the focus of this panel. We've begun to discuss this to some extent. Solidarity, and in particular, the basis of solidarity, can be conceptualized in different ways or as falling along different points on a continuum, let's say. Barbara and Adam, in the article, we've now discussed at some length, you describe expressions of solidarity that are grounded, at least initially, in an alignment of interests. In fact, in a strategic alignment of interests. You describe, for example, how the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which called into question the ability of white citizens to exclude slavery anywhere in the country, motivated Northerners who, in fact, disdained Black people to support the anti-slavery coalition because it meant they could keep Black people away from the places where they lived. But further along the continuum is a conception of solidarity grounded in the recognition of the genuine interdependence of our social, political, and material interests. This is a thread, as we've been discussing, that also runs strongly through all of your work. It's also, for example, the overarching theme of Heather McGhee's best-selling new book, The Sum of Us. But further still on the continuum of solidarity are expressions of solidarity and collective action that might be characterized as reflecting the recognition of our, let's say, spiritual or moral interdependence as human beings. So at this end of the spectrum, compromise or alignment between different interests or different interest groups gives way to genuine sacrifice and altruism, to genuine humility and kinship. In other words, the frames that designate anyone as other begin to dissipate. Again, we've started to delve into this, but I want to ask you more explicitly, how do your ideas about solidarity and its evolving expression relate to this spectrum? Adam, maybe I'll go to you first, because elsewhere I've heard you say something that I found to be extremely striking. You said, and I'm quoting, "The only language we have in this country to describe a collective effort to do something big is war." End of quote. One of the observations implicit in this statement is that even our conceptions of solidarity are somehow embedded in and shaped by a linguistic and conceptual framework that assumes contest and conflict and otherness. Can and should we cultivate expressions of solidarity that genuinely transcend this framework? And if so, how?
That quotation is actually from a tweet. I tweeted that. And I actually tweeted that in response to a pronouncement by then President Trump as we entered into the pandemic, where he declared that we were going to win this war against COVID. And probably one should never comment or even think about President Trump's tweets, but that one did strike me as expressing an important and very common sentiment that the way we collectively organize ourselves for big tasks is through the rhetoric of war. And you can think of the war on poverty or the war on drugs or all of these collective efforts that are inappropriately characterized as war, just to see that it's such a common phenomenon. But it's also tragic. Not to take anything away from the people who actually, sacrifice their blood and lives in war, but it's a disheartening metaphor. The idea that we can only organize ourselves for collective acts of solidarity by imagining an enemy that we fight against is just such a failure of imagination. And I was thinking at that time, actually, I've been reading a lot of Walt Whitman. And I've been reading a lot of Whitman's wartime poetry from the Civil War. And the thing about Whitman that's so interesting is that he spent a lot of time during the war in hospitals. He haunted the hospitals of Washington, D.C., tending to the wounded and the sick and ruminating on that experience. And yes, war shadows Whitman's conception of collective and national solidarity, but he was more interested in healing than in fighting, in the care that people were showing towards each other than in the violence of the war itself. And I think that there is a language alongside of the language of war. There is a language of care as well. You can see it in Lincoln's Lincoln's invocation of the aspiration to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for the widow and orphan. There is a way of thinking about care and healing as binding us together that's different, not unconnected, but different from the language of war.
Pat, I want to get your response to this. How do you conceptualize solidarity along, an imagined spectrum from strategic self-interest as the basis of solidarity to something approximating genuine kinship and oneness and even love?
Yeah. So a couple things. The first is, look, I'm a retired military officer, and
you've served this country in uniform for decades. We should acknowledge.
Right. Yeah. So I think the misappropriation of the war metaphor that Adam just laid out is exactly right. The appropriate purpose.
That's a relief to hear you say.
Yeah, exactly. the appropriate purpose of a standing military is to deter war, not to wage it. To be capable of waging war if attacked, but not to build this instrument and then go around smashing things around the world. So the wars is the point of military is actually to avoid war, not to carry it out when it's principled. So that's number one. Number two on the solidarity question. Look, there's a political philosopher, Sally Scholes, who talks about different kinds of solidarity: political solidarity, civic solidarity, social solidarity. She writes a whole book about it, which I won't try I will try to summarize in 3 sentences. The first is that political solidarity is the duties that people have to one another because of some moral cause. So they stand together because there's been a moral harm that has happened to group members and they're trying to rectify it. Civic solidarity, and these are Scholz's definitions. Civic solidarity is when the state is in breach of contract, or the citizenry is in breach of contract, in breach of the social contract. So civic solidarity is when people stand together and make demands of the state to remedy something. And then social solidarity is the connection between people that are experienced when you're thrust into a situation, like family members or those who have been victimized by a national disaster or some, a crime of assault or something like that, or even the military, for example. By circumstance, you form solidarity with others who have experienced similar things. And my view of the kind of attainable solidarity in a polity that encourages the state to deliver on its responsibilities and obligations to the citizenry is a combination of the political and civic solidarity. And in my view, the kind of solidarity that will help us mitigate the effects of racism is the kind that will, one, recognize that racism is a crime of the state, and two, that recognizes that people across lines of class and race and ethnicity recognize that racism harms some members of the group more than others, but harms all members of the group. And because of this harm, they take a moral stand with one another in order to address the harm. So it's not quite love. And love is a very expensive emotion, if you know what I mean. It requires a lot of us. And I don't know that in a nation of our size, it's possible to realize true love across the citizenry or true friendship across the citizenry. It has to be interest-based, but it doesn't have to be materially interest-based alone. I don't have to appeal to your pocketbook in order for you to stand in solidarity with me, because often that sort of solidarity is much too thin. However, I cannot appeal to you only on the principles of love or morality, because without self-interest, people will be unwilling to sacrifice their personal safety, security for a moral cause, and more times than not, because of just the imperfections in humanity. And so somewhere on that rheostat, trending closer, I think, to the morality piece, but really in the center, we have to make both the moral argument and the interest argument in order to create a sustainable and durable solidarity across lines of race and class and in a nation of our size.
Barbara?
One thing I'd like to say is that one experience that in the past has allowed people to experience solidarity is one that it's always been rather thin in this country, and it has gotten ever thinner. And that is taking part in labor unions. That's a kind of solidarity that is based on shared interest, but only up to a point, because the point of union solidarity also was that you owe something to others at a time when you can't get anything out of their struggle, because at some future time, you're going to be able to call on them to help you with your struggle. And the fact that even that kind of belonging is such a rare experience in our society is both cause and consequence of what's happened to our society. But I also want to point out that our very laws teach us not to act in solidarity. I mean, labor unions are forbidden to engage in secondary boycotts. That's how we know them in this country. People know anything about it, the lawyers and so on. That's the language they use. In the past, it wouldn't have been called secondary boycott. It would have been called solidarity. We don't have that anymore as a practical reality, even in the labor movement. So it's not surprising that it's very hard to conjure it anywhere else. I don't know how we can recover that. But I think that some people in our society are recovering it precisely because they're rediscovering labor action. I think about Sarah Nelson and the Flight Attendants Union, but I'm also thinking about the Union of the Graduate Student Workers at my own university. And I don't know how far those experiences will go, but that is the way people learn about solidarity in a way that combines the motive that is altruistic with the motive that is self-interested.
Well, I want to turn now a little bit more directly to your work, Ted. In the face of racism, which you characterize as an existential threat to the idea of America, you make a compelling case for the formation of a new form of national solidarity supported by a national civil religion. But as you seem to recognize yourself, reliance on the nation as an axis of solidarity is not without its challenges. And these challenges, I think, have become quite well known in the American context in recent years. For example, to many in this country, the traditional symbols of American civic and public life tell a story that is either woefully unrepresentative or just plainly untrue. And the fact that the narrative really of any nation is socially constructed and reconstructed means that its parameters of inclusion and otherness, in other words, who's a real American and who's not, can be continually contested, whether it's on the basis of skin color or ideology or one's decision to take a knee at a football game. Now, none of this, of course, should lead us to dismiss the potential power of national solidarity, but it does compel us to think deeply, as I know you do, about the conditions under which a national solidarity can be made genuinely secure and genuinely inclusive. One of the ideas that I've arrived at grappling with these questions in my own work is that by embedding our national solidarity firmly and deliberately within the recognition of our essential oneness as human beings, we might finally begin to relieve nationalism of its destructive and exclusionary potential. In other words, by situating our national identity within the frame of a genuinely universal human identity, an identity from which, literally no one can be othered, we might fundamentally recast our national story and conversation in ways that protect them from these various pitfalls. Now, these are obviously hard questions and big ideas, but they're ones that I know, Ted, you engage with directly. So I'll start with you. How can we fundamentally ensure that national solidarity becomes and remains expressive of its highest potential?
Yeah, so this is a hard question and one that we can only hypothesize about, since I don't think a society like ours, a nation like ours has ever seen such a thing. The first thing I will say is nation states are amoral. They do not have moral compasses. What is good for a state is what is right, and what is bad for a state is what is wrong, and what is right and wrong changes based on what that state believes at any given point in time. The Taliban used to be a friend to the United States when they were meeting with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and then suddenly they were the enemy of the United States when George Bush was president. So there is no right or wrong. It's sort of what's in the nation's interest. When you're talking, so because a nation state is amoral, then it is hard to make a nation do a thing based on a moral purpose, or where a material or some security interest isn't immediately in question. This is what makes national solidarity so difficult, because you're trying to build within a citizenry in a nation state a connection that is not based solely on material interest, but on something deeper. The gift among the many things the founders got wrong, intentionally or unintentionally, they gave us the gift of the Declaration and words in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. This is something that Abraham Lincoln used to wage war, and eventually that led to the abolishment of slavery and the 14th and 15th Amendments, enfranchising Black men, at least at that point. It also, it is the foundation of what Martin Luther King said at in the March on Washington in 1963. And so those words, the principles of equality, the principles of unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, these are the only things that a nation like ours has to connect all of us to one another. It's not language, it's not race, it's not ethnicity, custom, religion, region, none of that stuff. It is only our belief, ostensibly, in these higher principles that connect us one to another, and a belief that my access to those things should be contingent on your access to those things. And where the nation has fallen short is when one group decides to hoard more of these universal principles for themselves, such that the principles are no longer universal, but are now treated as commodities and resources that are in short supply and are in our zero sum. So the purpose of national solidarity is to show that none of us can truly experience these principles. None of us can experience justice for us or our families, equality for us or our families, opportunity, life, liberty, if we allow the state to deprive access to these principles to other groups in our same society. So it is interest driven, but the interest isn't just material. The interest is principle-based. But that principle-based materialism, for lack of a better term, has material consequences. The highest rates of suicide right now are among white men in rural America who feel like they've been displaced in this diversifying, demographically changing America that's giving out money and opportunities to people of color. That's not true, but the change in our social structure over the last 200 years has caused some who used to be advantaged to feel like their social status has been robbed of them, and now they feel less advantaged or their identity has been threatened. And there's a whole discussion about the type of personal, individual, ontological security that people and groups feel when others rise up, that sort of builds onto this. But the point of national solidarity is to help us see past those manufactured divisions among a citizenry, and see that the only way we can access the principles that connect us for ourselves and those we love is to extend them to all of those in the polity. The last thing I'll say on the civil religion piece, you're absolutely right that this is easily hijacked. And in fact, when we see politicians using the national anthem or the flag or the Statue of Liberty or any of these totems of Americanism or patriotism as instruments or cudgels to beat their fellow citizens over the head with, it's a problem. But the point I want to make is that it is sort of the exercise or the demonstration of this belief system that a national civil religion defines and gives us the ability to commune together and sort of show solidarity with one another in actionable ways. In the article with this idea, the American civil religion was introduced in 1967 by the sociologist Robert Bellah. He says America's first time of trial was at its founding to determine whether or not a country could be created on principle and not religion, not ethnicity, et cetera. The second time of trial was around the question of slavery and whether a country founded on equality could persist, endure, while it's enslaving people. And now in his writing in 67, he says that we're at our third time of trial. And this is whether a multiracial democracy can exist, like the United States is trying to build. This is an open question, and to your prompt for this part of the discussion here, we have not yet answered it. We do not yet know if it's possible. It's feasible. We can write blueprints for it or roadmaps for how to get there, but whether or not we have the will and the interest in actually achieving this society and all of the sacrifice and forbearance it requires is an open question.
Adam, thank you for that, Ted. A very thorough answer. Adam, similar question to you. How can we protect national solidarity from its pitfalls and reimagine it for the good?
I think one thing that we could do is recover and celebrate the possibility of a national solidarity that accommodates just an incredibly diverse people. Back to Whitman, we contain multitudes, and we ought to celebrate that fact, but it can really only be celebrated if it's organized on a principle of equality, as I think Ted was saying. One of my favorite books of late is a book by the political theorist Danielle Allen called Our Declaration, that really makes us through a very close reading of the actual language of the Declaration and the process by which it was written. She emphasizes the principle of equality that's embedded in that document, and it's a principle that can help us think about the organization of a diverse society. Diversity without equality, well, that's a slave ship. Diversity with equality is a healthy human community. There have been moments and principles in American history that actually serve as a compass for that kind of balance between solidarity and difference. And the one I will point to, which is really quite remarkable is the principle of religious pluralism, embodied by the combination of the establishment and free exercise clauses. The founders of the country knew that the population had very diverse religious practices. And through a combination of Enlightenment principles and hard political infighting, they forged a principle that would allow people of very different and sometimes antagonistic religious denominations, mostly Christian, to live together. That is a model. It has its flaws. It hasn't been perfect, but it's a great model for conceiving of a diverse society as a healthy one.
Barbara?
Well, I'd like to recall to the attention of our audience Jim Hightower's father's saying, "Everybody does better when everybody does better." Because I think there is an essential material underpinning for any sense of solidarity. And people who feel as though they have lost status, and then when you look more closely at it, you find out talking about, for example, white people in rural areas. There's no hospital anywhere around because the last one closed down. Family members are caught up in the law enforcement system because of their dependence on drugs. For example, and they go to jail rather than to rehabilitation because there is no rehabilitation. And the jobs that used to the blue-collar jobs that used to establish people in what Americans like to think of as the middle class, or for that matter, even work on the farm that used to be a basis for people's livelihoods. That's all gone. So there's no point in going to people who have experienced this kind of material loss and deprivation and telling them, oh yes, but we have principles that should bind us together. We can't expect them to bind us together until we have bound up the wounds, until we have created, we'll never get to equality, but something approaching and always tending toward a material equity, if not equality, then there's no point in going to people with principles of solidarity. We need to have the material basis for solidarity. And that, I think, it's going to be very difficult in a society where the differences between multi-billionaires and the rest of us are so immense. We have the resources to bring everybody up to a certain level of decency, to have proper systems of education everywhere, proper medical care everywhere, proper environmental controls everywhere. We have that possibility in principle, but we don't because power is as unequally distributed as resources are in a country where we think it's perfectly normal that there should be some people whose wealth and income are greater than that of many member states of the United Nations, and that they inhabit the same polity with those of us who don't have anything but our vote. And there are people scheming to take that away. Solidarity has to begin with the material, is the point I'm making.
Well, the relationship between unity and justice and power is certainly a critical and complicated one.
Yep.
So that's an important point. We have received an abundance of wonderful questions, and I want to try to weave them into our conversation. One audience member says, on college campuses today, the dominant discourses on race and social justice lack much of the nuance we're hearing on this panel. How can more nuanced discourse on these themes be fostered on college campuses today? I would add that this nuance is lacking in many of the discourses of our society. And I might actually take and I was noting as we were talking earlier, how many of the exchanges we were having just don't seem possible in many venues of our broader society. And I might take the liberty of tacking on another question to this one that I think is indirectly related, but then I'll put it to you and let you address it however you want. One of the impediments also to a robust and far-reaching solidarity, as well as a discourse that leads to that sort of solidarity, seems to be the close association in our predominant discourses and institutions between responsibility on the one hand and blame on the other. It's intuitive, I think, to most people that in this hard work of justice and social change, each of us, every single one of us, has a role to play. But the tendency to tie responsibility to the assignment of fault seems to complicate this intuition and to introduce very persistent sources of division and resistance. Actually, Ted, you put it very eloquently, I think, in one of your articles. You say, quote, a gaping fault line emerges between white and non-white Americans, with the former feeling unfairly maligned for historical actions, and the latter taking umbrage that those harmed by racism should be responsible for its eradication. So the question is, what's the way out of this? And what are the implications for cultivating a type of discourse that allows for this type of nuance and genuine dialogue?
Two things. One, if there's any place in our society where nuanced discussions about race in America should be happening, it's on college campuses. And so if it's not happening there, you can forget about it happening in the media, at the dining room table, at your kid's soccer game. It's not going to happen anywhere if we can't have nuanced conversations in the halls of the academy where faculty engage students. How do we get that there? I would say not to rely solely on a school's faculty to have these conversations, but to invite others in for out of classroom engagements, symposiums, et cetera, in order to explore these ideas at length and be willing to be offended, to have your beliefs challenged, and not take offense or those challenges as personal attacks on your identity, on your group's place in the hierarchy, or on historical experiences of certain groups in America. You have to be willing, and this is where I talk about, like we've all talked about, the importance of sacrifice and forbearance. You cannot have honest conversations about racism, to your second question, if the immediate next question is, let's find out what's the problem so we can find out who's responsible, so we can find out whose job it is to fix the problem that we all agree is a problem. And as soon as that blame game begins, you can forget about solving the problem, because all of us here are victimized by racism. None of us are creators of it. We were born into a system that predated our existence, and we're trying to sort of manage our lives within it. And folks will feel will take offense to being told it's your job to fix it, whether they're the ones who have mostly benefited from the system or the ones who have mostly been victimized by it. The last thing I'll say on this is that this is why I think thinking of racism as a crime of the state is more useful, because now it doesn't pit citizens against one another, though certainly there has been a social hierarchy that has stratified the citizenry, but it places the blame of fixing the problems on the state, because after all, the state's interest, whether it was economic interest in during slavery or social interest in certain parts of the country post-slavery, it perpetuated the structures that allowed racism to persist. Therefore, if we're going to blame someone or assign the responsibility of addressing racism, it must be on the state. And that means the vehicle for doing so is public policy. Doesn't solve racism, but it can help mitigate the effects. Solving it will require more than nation states. It require religion and philosophy and other acts of character and identity that weigh in on us.
Barbara?
The questioner is talking about, as I understood the question, discourse on college campuses. And so I'm going to answer that from my capacity as a teacher. I don't have any power, indeed, on my college campus that goes beyond my classroom. So all I can talk about is what I try to do in my classroom. And one of the things I tell the students in my History of the South lecture class at the very beginning of each semester is, we're in this class, we are going to be doing history. And the greatest lie that can appear in any work of history is the word we. Because as historians, we're not we. The people we're talking about are they. They are not us, and many of them are remote from us, even though students may have the illusion that somebody who in that ridiculous expression looks like me, because nobody looks like anybody else in truth. But the illusion that because someone in some ridiculous sense is supposed to look like you, that therefore you have an insight into their mind. And so I try to disabuse my students of that right from the outset. I can't do anything about anybody who's not in my classroom on that subject, but I do find that it's hard work. It is a heavy lift doing that even in a classroom. Let me give an example that comes from many years ago when I was teaching. I wasn't at Columbia, let's put it that way. And I had assigned my class to read, or I had given them the choice in writing their papers of historians to read. I had assigned somebody, and then I told them, you can write your paper comparing this person's work to somebody else's work. And a young white woman came to my office, and she was in tears because she had decided that she was going to compare two books that were about slaveholding women in the Old South. And one of them argued that slaveholding women, like slaveholding men, they were slaveholders, and that was that. The other one argued that slaveholding women were in some kind of solidarity, moral if not otherwise, with the slaves, because they had a bond of, they had a relationship because they were both victims of male domination. And she was in tears because she said, I want to believe the second, the idea of solidarity between women slaveholders and the slaves, but I'm afraid the other one is right. And I said to her, tell me, how many slaves do you have? And it actually took her several seconds before she understood what I was asking her, which was, why do you feel as though you have to carry the burden for the slaveholding women? Why do you need to feel bad on their account? That is difficult to do. It was difficult then, and that was many years ago. It's even more difficult in some ways now because there are so many people, whether they're on campus or off campus, telling people like that young woman, yes, you do need to feel responsible because you are that slaveholding woman. Don't try to put any distance between you and her because you're all the same. Well, that is certainly ahistorical. As a historian, I'm always working against that. It's harder now because of people who have taken it on. It's practically their Apostles' Creed that they must think that way. But what I'm doing in the classroom all the time is trying to get the students to understand that as a historian, you are not, your solidarity has to be with humanity. It can't be with a particular group in a particular place, and therefore you can look at history objectively. That does not mean neutrally. And I have to do many conversations in my classroom have to help the students know the difference between objective and neutral. They're not the same thing.
Adam?
Well, Barbara was and is my teacher, and
I made you speak after her once again. I apologize.
But you know, I've absorbed and internalized many of the things that she says about teaching. So they just resonate with me. But I have to say, you know, the idea that nuanced and sophisticated conversations are not happening on college campuses is to me a caricature, if not a slander. I just spent a whole semester with 100 Georgetown undergraduates looking carefully and closely at our own school's history, including our history of slavery. And the students came from all sorts of backgrounds and perspectives. And, you know, we managed to hold it together, albeit remotely, for a whole semester. And I was so impressed by the students' capacity for thoughtfulness and for mutual respect. You know, I think that I don't think I'm alone in that. I think these sorts of things are happening in a lot of places, in a lot of college campuses across the country. So I'm kind of optimistic about that. But I do think that in our classrooms, we try to proceed on the basis of a solid foundation of good information and an ethic of learning, that we're all learning. We don't have all the answers. We don't know everything, and there's a lot to learn. And I'll stick by those principles. I think they're great principles to go by for any kind of conversation. Know your stuff and respect each other. And I wish more people would abide by those basic rules. We'd get a little bit farther.
Well, this is a related question, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I can't resist because we started, I think, with such a powerful discussion about justice and how to conceptualize justice. And this audience member asks, do the panelists have ideas for formulating a positive shared vision of justice beyond overcoming current forms of oppression? Easy question, obviously, to answer in just a few minutes, and you've already begun to do it. But maybe I'll give each of you a couple of minutes to share the first ideas that come to mind, and then we'll end on a question of history before we close the panel. Barbara?
Well, the only thing I can say is to reiterate what I already said. I think we cannot talk about establishing justice on a high-flying plane until we are tackling the problems of material inequality at the level where they actually cause people suffering. Until we tackle those, and we can tackle them. We have the resources in this country to do that. Nobody needs to be homeless. Nobody needs to be in a substandard school. Nobody needs to have no access to health care or drug rehabilitation. We have chosen to put those things out of the picture. But I think that justice in an abstract sense has to begin with justice in a material sense. And we cannot expect people to be thinking about their oneness, their shared humanity with everybody else, when we're requiring them to accept that other people might live in a house, but I can't. Other people's children might be educated, and they're being groomed from preschool to end up in an Ivy League university. And my kids can't even gain basic literacy. You know, we can't do it that way. So I think we have to start with tackling the things that leave people in material suffering that we have the resources to fix.
on top of that, we've seen in the last decade something that we really haven't seen before in this country for a very long time, and that's declining life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
People are not living as long as they used to. And that it has actually been a sustained decline across years recently. And it's a shocking statistic that indicates a real problem in the health of our society. So I think when we think about trying to build a more just society, we can start by making sure people live longer, healthier, and more fulfilling lives rather than the opposite.
Ted?
Yeah, and I would just say, in John McCain's concession speech the night he lost to Barack Obama, he said something that stood out to me, a number of things, but one is nothing about America is inevitable. And this is something we've heard from the earliest generations. And basically, it's a lot of previous generations have kicked the can down the road, leaving it for future generations to solve. And the problem, of course, becomes more intractable, more entrenched, the more we avoid trying to address it. So I think the way to formulate a positive shared vision, one is to think about posterity. The issues we do not solve are going to be visited with more vigor on future generations. And there is nothing about this that suggests we're going to find our way out of it. It could actually be the thing that undoes the whole experiment. The other thing I will say, which is less comforting, is that we are still a culture that is very much, that loves our heroes. And so my sense is that there will need to be some sort of transformative figure or leader or someone to model what the next version of this country looks like, and to sort of be the embodiment. And this is what civil religion sort of suggests in Lincoln and Martin Luther King and others, Frederick Douglass, George Washington, for all imperfections that they may have had in different parts of their life, in one or a number of multiple very significant ways, they embodied a struggle to become that more perfect union. And that person has been absent, I think, in recent years. And in order for us to get to that next version of what the country can be, we need to see the embodiments of it, see it exemplified through, prototypical citizens.
Well, I think your point, Ted, raises questions for another panel and another discussion about, what is it that will motivate addressing or redressing this economic or material inequality that Barbara is talking about. It's not that we don't have the material resources in a country like the United States to do it. It's that we somehow lack the will or even the solidarity. So the meaning or the purpose that's going to drive this change in policy and lead to the redistribution into a more equitable set of structures materially, I think is also an open question and one that we have to grapple with. But that is a big question for another time. We're just about completely out of time, but to close the panel, I want to turn our attention again very briefly to history. Barbara and Adam, you are, of course, historians. Ted, you're an astute student of American history. And the lessons of the past have, I think, very clearly shaped our conversation today. But before we end, I want to invite you more explicitly to help us, so to speak, look back in order to move forward. Very briefly, maybe in less than a minute, what is one lesson from history that you would emphasize as we reflect on forming a far-reaching emancipatory movement in today's America? Barbara?
Why don't you let Adam start?
All right, Adam.
I usually find myself saying things like, "Well, we should try to avoid civil wars." Those aren't healthy. Those aren't good. But I do think about Lincoln in justifying emancipation, saying that in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. And I think that is a way of thinking about solidarity. That's a way of thinking, a way in his particular moment of saying everybody does better when everybody does better. There's a lot to learn from that, the way that Lincoln thought about emancipation.
Ted, what historical lesson would you leave us with?
Yeah, I would say that between the years 1948 and 1968, we saw the greatest strides for between the races for racial equality, equality writ large, since the end of the Civil War. 48 is when Truman signs the desegregation of the military and orders desegregating the military and the federal workforce. 54, we've got Brown v. Board that says, separate but equal is unconstitutional. Civil Rights Act of 57, another one a few years later, and the Civil Rights Act of 64. Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68, 20 years of tremendous progress. That was not because there was a wave of epiphanies among white Americans. This wasn't a result of white magnanimity. This was a result of material and political calculations. Truman needed to win the election of 48, and Black voters that were disenfranchised in the South had migrated in the Great Migration to the North and helped him win a few states. And so the lesson here is that when we can marry moral claims to material, political, national security interests, then we can achieve tremendous progress in a short amount of time relative to the national project. And so the lesson is not just to make moral appeals or not just to make material appeals, but to do both things and show how the one is unachievable without the other. And if history is a guide here, it suggests that when we have the right set of people doing that thing, that we can achieve great promise, or at least take another step closer to being who we profess to be.
Mm-hmm. And Barbara, to you goes the last word.
Oh dear. Well, if I'd been speaking first, I probably would have used the achievement of emancipation as my illustration, because emancipation came about as a result of many cross purposes and mixed purposes and contradictory purposes that happened to coalesce, and just for a brief time, in support for the Union, which necessarily involved emancipation. But then I decided, well, Adam already talked about Lincoln and emancipation, so maybe the one I should leave the audience with is, unfortunately, a political movement that did not succeed, populism. Now, I'm not talking about the ersatz populism that the media today talk about. I'm talking about the late 19th century movement that was primarily agrarian, although not exclusively. And in the end, the populists were defeated. But the reason I put it forward as an example for us to think about is that it was a moment when a large number of people still believed that by their collective action, they could actually do something constructive and make a better future. And I don't think we have that confidence today. I don't know how to reinstate it, but I do think that in spite of their failure, the people who came together and who organized in different ways, also at cross purposes, in the last decades of the 19th century, still thought that they had the power in their hands to change the country for the better.
Barbara Fields, Ted Johnson, Adam Rothman, what a rich conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.